Hello, my name is Ronnie Manning, and I'm the Director of Public Relations at Yubico. We would like to thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Centrify Identity Service plus YubiKeys, easy to use MFA everywhere. Presenting today will be David Maples, Senior Solutions Engineer from Yubico, and Chris Weber, Director of Product Marketing for Centrify. The webinar will go approximately 30 minutes with a Q&A session to follow. To submit your questions, please use the questions form in the GoToWebinar menu on the right side of your screen. We would like to thank you again for attending, and now I would like to pass it off to Chris.
Thanks very much. I appreciate it. Welcome, everybody. I am Chris Weber from Centrify, and I want to start out a little bit by talking about sort of a security landscape, what we know we're all facing. I was a former IT guy myself. I was fighting a lot of these battles before I moved over to the product side to try to help solve them. And one of the things that has changed, I feel like, is that back in the day when I was sitting in the seat, I had a lot of sophisticated cyber criminals trying to bring down my systems, trying to get access to my stuff. A lot of my stuff was in the building, 3 floors down, in the data center. I could go touch the air conditioning units. I could touch my racks of servers. Today we see something a little bit different. We still see lots of attacks, but instead of these sophisticated criminals, we've got folks that are leveraging compromised credentials, sort of the easiest route in. That's what I want to talk about a little bit today. We see more and more headlines from a lot of companies that are being attacked, and it's not just us saying that compromised credentials, that usernames and passwords are the problem. Folks like Verizon in the data breach investigations report from last year said that over 50% of breaches come from these compromised credentials. In the 2016 version of the report that just came out, 63% from compromised credentials. That is heading up. It is the #1 leading point of attack, and I'm going to talk about why that's such low-hanging fruit for these bad guys as we kind of get into it. So if we look at the next slide, what we see is that we're making it kind of easier for these non-sophisticated cyber criminals, these folks that are really targeting the soft underbelly of our organizations by using more passwords than ever and being human beings at the same time. Gizmodo said it better than I could. They pulled together this list of data from a company called Splash Data. Splash Data took all the passwords that were compromised in 2015 and they sorted them by most popular to least popular, the most often used to the least often used. Here's the top 25 most often used passwords. This is what we're all using. This is what our employees are all using to protect their cloud apps, their VPN, their domain credentials if we don't have a more sophisticated policy put in place potentially. Things like the word password or football or baseball. This is because we just can't remember all the passwords we use. Here at Centrify, we find when we talk to customers that it's often the case that about 17 different apps are commonly used, which 17 different passwords potentially to use those app sites and services, up to about 75. If you actually think about the amount that you've got every day that we all use, the ones we type every single day, maybe 3, 4, or 5 of those, but the ones we use once a month, once a year, when we go to our rewards point for our frequent flyer miles or those other things, these things expand very quickly. We can't remember them all. We reuse passwords, and we use passwords like this that are easy to remember sometimes, or at least our employees sometimes do, which makes us easy targets because folks don't even need to try very hard to get in, right? They can just pick one of these and see if they can get in. Next slide, please. Combining that problem, right, this multiple password problem, this easy to guess password problem, with the fact that lots of our users are moving outside of our traditional control. You remember I was saying back when I was in the IT seat, I could actually go down and touch all my resources, right? My infrastructure was there for me in the building. I did have one outsourced data center, but I could drive to that and I could put my arms around my stuff there as well. But today, with mobile devices on the rise, with software as a service becoming super popular, right? Services like Box, Dropbox, or Marketo, Travelzoo, whatever it may be, right? Infrastructure as a service with Amazon and Rackspace, Linode, you name it, for hosting all of our services. And then employees demanding access anywhere. Attackers don't have to fight their way through our perimeter defenses anymore to get to our resources. It used to be sort of like an Ocean's 11 kind of caper film, right? How do we tunnel underneath the bank? How do we have the right dynamite or the explosives to actually get through the side of the vault? Then how do we have all the right equipment to actually get the money out before they find out that we're there before the alarms go off. They had to tunnel through past a proxy, past a firewall, past maybe a next-gen firewall. They had to get through our security policy to get to our resources. But now if they can just target a cloud app, well, then they just have to deal with getting a username and password and walking right through the front door. And as we saw, some of those usernames and passwords are easier than ever to get to. With the perimeter dissolving, IT is often out of control of where a lot of this data lies. We're certainly not in control of who gets to choose what cloud app or what infrastructure is in use. It kind of expands that attack surface, means the attackers have an easier time trying to find the easy route in. Next slide. So what this is really boiled down to is what we see commonly time and time again. When we investigated, and I've investigated many, many of the attacks that happened over the last couple of years, they all boil down into something that I'll get to in a second, but they all follow an interesting chain. They don't just target that privileged account anymore, that IT systems administrator who's got root or admin privilege to his Unix and Linux machines or his Windows infrastructure, right? They're targeting everybody. In many cases, what we see is that the end users are now under attack. The folks who are just going about their business, the person in finance or the person in marketing who's just trying to do their job, who's using cloud apps to do it, if they get compromised, if the bad guy can get access to their information, learn a little bit about them, they can use that as a stepping stone to get into the network, to get to that privileged user, to take over machines and get whatever information they want out to them to exfiltrate that data. We'll talk about that in a second. We're going to see that this is easier than ever. If we go to the next slide, we'll see that it's not just the passwords that we had before. So let's see that next slide. It's not just those 25 top passwords. It's billions of passwords that have actually been stolen. So the easily guessable passwords, those are a problem, right? The easily brute force passwords, those are a problem. But what's even more of a problem is the fact that in the last 2 years, almost 2 billion passwords have been compromised that we know about. These are just the ones that were reported on in the media. Many, many more, certainly, maybe double that amount for all we know, have been compromised and not reported on. These passwords are now on the dark web in the hands of whoever wants them, oftentimes for free or certainly for pennies. And when we have these, the bad guys can infiltrate. Now, what does this infiltrate mean? If we go to the next slide, I'll talk about sort of what we're going to do, and we'll break this down and we'll look at the anatomy of these cyber attacks. The first phase, we call this the infiltrate phase, then there's the elevate phase, then the appropriate phase. In this infiltrate phase, the attackers are finding the easiest way. Again, these aren't the sophisticated attackers necessarily of yesterday, where they were really good at figuring out a way through all of our defenses. They've realized it's much easier to go where the defenses aren't, and they infiltrate by using one of those stolen or harvested passwords, by brute forcing passwords, or just by trying some of those simple passwords and getting access to end user data. If they can do it the right way, then they can elevate. They can actually get away from that end user and get to somebody who has a little more privilege on the network, someone who can actually run systems and machines, and then they can move laterally and appropriate, take that all over. I'll break that down step by step here over the next couple of slides. So if we move into this infiltrate phase on the next slide, what we see is that the external users are more often than not the easiest route in. If you look at the popular, not the popular, but the highly publicized attacks over the last couple of years, what we see is it's often an end user, it's often a partner who's actually the original source of this. Not because they're behaving badly, they're actually just trying to do their jobs. But the bad guys target those folks, underbelly of the organization. They often target them with emails based on real data. If they can't brute force a password to get in, if they can't use one of that they've already stolen, which is super easy, then they can send emails. And these emails can be based on real data. I often will participate in speaking sessions myself, right? And sometimes I put that information on, for example, LinkedIn. I'll be out at the RSA trade show, and we'll be talking about this X, Y, or Z thing because it's the security conference for the global situation. In fact, what we see here is I was doing a speaking opportunity out in Pittsburgh, and we were looking for different speakers to also bolster the sort of the talent pool there, so to speak, right? It'd be very easy for a bad guy to send an email like this when they saw this on my LinkedIn. Hey, Chris, we're speaking out at the event in Pittsburgh. I'd love to speak with you. Here's my bio, here's my samples. Let me know if you think I'm a fit. Now, I'm a security-minded guy, but I might actually fall victim to this kind of attack. If it looked like it came from a legitimate email source, if it had an attachment that looked like a CV or a bio, I might open that. But if that bio was really just a delivery mechanism for a rootkit that looked for vulnerabilities in my browser, for example, to look for out-of-date Java or out-of-date Flash or something to that effect that I hadn't updated in a long time, and could then install a keylogger and start seeing all the passwords that I typed, now my computer's been taken over. That keylogger steals access. The infiltrate phase is now taken over. This is a more sophisticated attack than just using a stolen password, of course, but it's still not that hard. These rootkits are available for free on the internet. Heck, they're on GitHub if you want to get them. It's not that hard for someone who's 15, 16 years old to figure out how to perpetrate these attacks. It's certainly not hard for someone who's a professional attacker who's looking to make money to do this. So now we move away. So now my machine's been compromised. The infiltration is over. How do we get to that elevate phase? And that's phase 2, the next slide. What happens in the elevate phase most often, and we see this in a lot of the attacks that have happened over the last couple of years, just like we saw that infiltrate phase happen, is that now that a machine has been compromised, right, the usernames and passwords are coming off, they're being exfiltrated, someone can actually be on that machine and they can start installing software on that machine potentially because they've compromised it in the first place, or they can certainly try to get VPN access and then get in from a different machine if they can, if the client config isn't that difficult to exfiltrate, or a number of other methods. But once they're on the network, they're looking for accounts with better access. They're packet capturing, they're seeing what they can find, and they're dumping password hashes with tools, again, that you can get on GitHub very easily. And a lot of these hashed passwords can either be reverse engineered. I was just at a session listening to some security experts talking about the fact that they were showing that within a second, a lot of hashed passwords can be reverse engineered at this point, right, with a sophisticated computer. But that's not that sophisticated. It's like a $900 server that you can get from Supermicro, right? You can reverse engineer these things, find out the password, or you can use pass the hash and just see if NTLM lets you push this anywhere you want and not even reverse engineer that. Now all of a sudden I look and smell and act like a systems administrator. I've found on the network a password being passed that might have been encrypted, but I'm able to use that password in a number of different places on that same network. I'm able to see where I can get. I move laterally from machine to machine, and I'm doing it as the systems administrator because I've stolen their credentials. That's the scary part. And that gets us to our appropriate phase here, the third step in our attack chain, which is the next slide. This appropriate phase means that now that I've got legitimate administrative credentials, which happens in a lot of these attacks, now I just try them on other machines. I RDP from one machine to the next, or I SSH across different machines, and I see what that access lets me have. If I've gotten root password privileges or admin password privileges, and I can get onto a domain controller, I can get into a group of Unix or Linux systems in a cluster that are all related, I might have root access to all those machines. And then I started installing software because I'm root. I can do what I want. I'm not the guy back in the day that wants to deface the system. I'm not the guy who wants to just delete all the information necessarily. I'm the guy that wants to install a lot of backdoors, and I want to figure out how to live in this network, how to make a lot of different ways to get into that network for myself, so that I can start looking for the valuable data that I can sell. I want to find easier ways in, right? Open VPNs that don't have multi-factor. I want to use these credentials. I want to feed them out to my network, and I want to find other systems that I can attack outside that network, like infrastructure as a service that might have those same root passwords. I can officially take over, and I look just like a systems administrator. It's really hard to catch these folks because they're using the same passwords, the same access, the same privileges that our actual legitimate good guy systems administrators are using who are trying to thwart and stop them. That's why we see in a lot of these attacks that the attack might be originally found, let's say, in May, but it's not solved until September or October. And then we see the next year they say, oh, we didn't remediate the whole thing. We found other systems that were compromised by that same attack, and they go back. You'll see that in the news time and time again if you look at some of these reports. These attacks are pretty nefarious, and they spread across our whole network. It's some scary stuff. Next slide, please. What can we do about it? So when we look at these three phases of attack, what we see is that it's time to do something better. in the news recently, right? Again, another funny article from Gizmodo, but it's actually very serious, and it links to the actual White House article that says it's basically time to end passwords. We're seeing here at Centrify lots of our customers moving away from just pure passwords into multi-factor authentication. They want to try to do it everywhere. So everyone down from the President of the United States of America to just little old me are telling that same story, which is we've got to do something better than passwords, because passwords are providing an easy way for that three-phased attack. And if we move to the next slide, we'll see that the reason we need to do this now, the reason that we need to take action today, is that what we've had before, I think we might need to actually click into the next slide here, sorry for that, is that over time, we've seen millions of passwords be compromised. Billions of passwords are compromised over the last couple of years. Password risk has gotten to an all-time high. And if we're protecting data with just a username and password, we're really not protecting that data at all. If we consider that billions of passwords have been stolen, certainly the odds that someone in our organization is one of those compromised people, that a bad guy does have the right information to get in as that user, well, then we're vulnerable already today. We need to do something today. We need to put multi-factor authentication in everywhere today to buy us the time to do the more sophisticated things in our network, and that's the next build, that actually will keep our attack surface minimized. If we implement multi-factor today, we can stop those pure password-based threats. Someone who already has a password or who's stealing with a keylogger our information is not going to be able to have the second factor they need to get in, to get onto a server, or to get onto our end user's machine, or to get in the box, or to get into the cloud app of your choice. They're just simply going to be thwarted at that, and they're going to have a whole new level of sophistication in order to try to get around that second factor. That buys us the time to consolidate identities and start writing policy that extends outside our firewall that says, okay, now that all this stuff's moved out, what can we do about it? What policy can we put out there in the world? What can we do for single sign-on that's also secure? Can we automate deprovisioning and provisioning of accounts? Can we implement least privilege so that we don't use root passwords or admin passwords anymore? People log in as themselves, and they have the right level of privilege to just do what they need. A DBA doesn't need the same access that a sysadmin needs, right? We limit that risk. But we can only do that if we buy ourselves the time with multi-factor auth. And that's kind of what I think we need to take into consideration today, and that's certainly what a lot of our customers are asking us to do. And I think now we can talk about how we can make that multi-factor authentication different than yesterday's MFA, different than the cumbersome sort of MFA that we're used to, that a lot of users pushed back on, that we were only able to implement for these servers here, or for this application there. That's MFA of yesterday. We need to think about MFA across all of our environment. And in order to do that, it has to work for employees and it has to work for IT. And there's new and better ways to do it, and that's what we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about. In fact, I think I'm going to hand it over to Yubico to talk a little bit about how we can make this simpler, easier, more convenient while still staying secure.
Thank you, Chris. I'm David Maples from Yubico, and I'll be talking about Yubico and the YubiKey. First, a little bit of historical data. Yubico was founded back in 2007, and before the entire awareness of the vulnerabilities of passwords was becoming mainstream. Our founder, Stina Ahrensvard, looked at the cyber landscape and saw that passwords would be the next point of attack for many cyber criminals. And not just passwords to large corporations or large data centers, important ones that people think of, but everyone's passwords, from the system administrators on the largest data centers to the mom and pops looking to secure their own email accounts. Therefore, Yubico was founded with a specific mission: to protect people and servers. And our offering, the YubiKey, was designed with that in mind. Our customers were so impressed that right now our customers include at least 8 of the top 10 internet companies, including names like Facebook, Google, Salesforce, and the like. We have more than, but on the other end, for individuals, we have more than millions of users in over 150 countries, individuals looking to protect their own accounts, their own information. Next slide, please. This is because when Yubico looked at the authentication landscape, they saw that there was a truism, that the easier something is to use and implement it, the lower security it is. Passwords are some of the simplest thing to implement and use. Users type them in. You're all aware of that. However, as Chris has discussed, they are horribly, horribly vulnerable. Moving up the chain from that, you can move to software apps, which many people have on their phones these days. You can use hardware OTP tokens, or you can use smart cards at the very top end. However, why doesn't everyone use smart cards? Because they're very complex to set up and they're very hard to use effectively. When we looked at this, we said we need to combine the functionality and security of a smart card with the ease of use of a single username and password. And that's what we developed the YubiKey for. Not a proprietary token for a specific system that requires all sorts of drivers and software to set up, but something you can just plug in you plug into your USB port, touch, and be on your way in a secure manner. Next slide, please. Right now, the YubiKey comes in 3 flavors. We have our YubiKey 4 keychain size, which fits into a USB port, and you can touch the little gold button on it to trigger it. You have the YubiKey Nano, which is designed to sit fully inside the USB port, and you can touch the tab sticking out. That's great for situations where you want to continue to protect a single computer rather than moving from location to location. And our YubiKey Neo, which has all the functionality of the other 2 YubiKeys plus NFC, near-field communication, which works great with Android NFC-enabled mobile devices. You can simply tap your YubiKey against the back of the device to authenticate. Next slide, please. And of course, the YubiKey would not be able to get where it is if it wasn't strongly manufactured in a secure way. We rely heavily on automation for the generation of the YubiKeys, both in Palo Alto, our USA office, as well as Sweden. And the YubiKeys are made in a unique fashion in that they're a complete monoblock design. There's no moving parts, no internal batteries, no internal cavities. All the components are completely sealed inside a high-strength plastic resin, making it very, very hard to damage the YubiKeys. YubiKeys can be custom programmed. That means that you users can load your own secrets onto the YubiKeys, cutting Yubico completely out of the loop, limiting your points of access for the secrets to compromise the YubiKeys. Or, if you wish to do so with Yubico, we will send you the secrets and remove them completely from our servers and programming stations. Essentially, unlike other tokens out there, once you receive your YubiKeys, they're yours. You own them from the hardware to the secrets loaded on them. And the only place that has access to those secrets is in your hands. So let's talk a little bit about the YubiKey itself. Next slide, if you would. The YubiKey, unlike other authentication devices, is a multi-factor, multi-solution device, multiple protocols. The YubiKey 4 has 6 independent modes that can be used simultaneously. You don't have to pick and choose. It has 2 OTP configurations, which include a legacy and open source solutions such as Oath, HOTP. It includes the Yubico OTP. It includes simple things like static passwords for situations where multi-factor authentication is not an option. We're looking at older routers or primitive BIOS type environments where multi-factor just will not be able to plug in. You can load a strong static password onto the YubiKey rather than keeping it open or accessible data center. The YubiKey can also simultaneously be used as a PIV-compliant smart card for authentication in Windows domains and others. Centrify has expanded this PIV functionality beyond just Windows to OS X and Linux as well. It can be used as an open PGP key store, allowing you to keep your PGP key for encryption, for signing, for code validation completely separate from any machine and leaving it on a secure device that's in your control. It can be used as an Oath time-based authentication device, replacing Google Authenticator on mobile devices and the like. And finally, it can be used as a FIDO U2F authenticator. U2F is a new protocol released by the FIDO Alliance, and it represents the ongoing quest to make authentication stronger and secure for everyone. Let's talk about the OTP modes. Next slide, please. So OTP stands for one-time password, and you're all familiar with this from one point or another. Your token or your phone generates a code and you type it in yourself. The YubiKey makes this incredibly simple and incredibly frictionless. You actually just have to touch the button on the YubiKey, the gold contact or the tab sticking out, just once. When the YubiKey is plugged in, it identifies as a USB keyboard and sends the code it generates internally as a series of keystrokes, as if you're typing it yourself. This means you can just click inside the field that you need to, touch the button, and the code is automatically entered in there. No need to type, worry about keeping things in sync, just touch and go. It supports the Oath protocol, both 6 and 8 digits, and it works with the Centrify local login solution. This is a new offering by Centrify to secure endpoints for unlawful access. What's more, like I mentioned previously, you can program your own secrets onto this. You don't need to trust Yubico. You don't need to trust anybody with your keys to your front door. We will provide the tools necessary to do so yourself should you so choose. This makes it incredibly powerful in that attacks against Yubico will never compromise your security. And finally, there are 2 OTP configurations that can be stored on the same devices, essentially making the YubiKey 2 OTP devices in one. This means that you can use the same YubiKey with your Centrify solution, and if you need a second one, say a static password for a very old router or a piece of equipment that hasn't been updated because of legacy reasons but can't support second-factor authentication because of its age, you can store the password for that on the device itself, making sure that you can secure everything from the very cutting edge to the legacy solutions as well. Next slide, please. For strong authentication, we recommend the PIV function on the YubiKey. This is supported out of the box by Windows. You can set up your Windows CA and use your YubiKey with it directly. And with Centrify's solution, you can extend that protection not just to Windows machines, but across your entire environment. Next slide, if you would. So the YubiKey PIV functionality is based on the openness standards, which means that as an open standard, there's no specific drivers you need to load, there's no specific software that needs to be included to use the YubiKey. It uses open drivers. You plug it in, you connect to the Microsoft Driver Center, it grabs the Microsoft generic CCID USB smart card reader driver, and you're good to go. Nothing from Yubico at this point. When you plug it in, it not only identifies as a smart card reader, but it identifies as a smart card plugged into that reader as well, which means there's nothing to mount, nothing that you need to plug in. You just push it into the USB port, you're off and you're going. The YubiKey actually takes the smart card authentication one step further though. With our unique touch to sign feature, you can tell your YubiKey, configure it to not perform any authentication, signing, or other action unless there's a physical presence confirming that you want to do so. This is something that smart cards have not been able to do so. If you've left your smart card plugged in, you entered your PIN to unlock it, and your computer was compromised, that malicious entity could use your PIN that you already typed in to unlock your smart card to perform the same actions without your knowing it. With touch to sign, they will not be able to do that because they physically cannot access your device. It basically takes what Chris was saying, you know, you could, in the past, you could physically access all your devices and actually go out to them and see them. This day it's not possible. With the YubiKey, it takes some of that ownership back to the user's hands. And as I mentioned previously, the PIV is supported natively in Windows and Centrify, allowing you to take the smart card solutions and extend them across your entire environment. Next slide, if you would. Of course, this dials back to one of the eternal questions of multi-factor authentication. What happens if you lose your key? Well, you know, really, there's no difference between your key to your accounts online as to the key to your house or your car. You keep them in a secure location on a keychain and whatnot. You configure multiple backup keys. You may just be at the system administrator level, issuing a new key as needed. It might be that you keep your keys in a secure location for backup in the event that one's lost or missing. But essentially, just like you have a spare key to your back door, that only you know of. You can do the same with your YubiKeys and your cybersecurity. You can also combine it with other multi-factor authentication options, SMS, mobile app security codes, and the like. We believe that hardware is a dedicated piece of hardware is the best form of authentication, but in the pinch, as an emergency, falling back to one of those can be, if implemented correctly and in a logical manner, can be used to regain access to accounts even if your YubiKey is not present. Once you've gotten into your account again, the first thing you want to do, of course, is revoke the key secret or certificate loaded on the device, essentially rendering it impossible for it to be used to access your solution or your accounts and whatnot, and making anybody, if they were targeting you maliciously, unable to proceed. This limits the amount of access they possibly could have because, as a two-factor authentication, the YubiKey is only part of that solution. The other half is getting an associated password. And with strong logical password policies combined with multi-factor authentication, you severely limit the opportunities for a malicious entity to attack your systems. They need to be able to have the cybersecurity to find a specific user's passwords. They need to have the physical access to that user to gain their YubiKey for multi-factor authentication. And with that level of requirements, 99.9% of all attacks will not be able to succeed. Somebody in China is not going to be able to walk into your office and steal your YubiKey. So with that, like I said, the YubiKey is only half the solution. The other half, of course, is the backend solution that uses the YubiKey to secure yourself and prevent any unsecured points of access. Chris will cover that with the Centrify solution. Next slide, if you would.
Hey. Thanks, David. I appreciate it. That's exactly right. I think what we're talking about here is really elevating our game, right? Making it much more difficult for these malicious entities to actually take over to get what they need. And in order to do that, we can't just think about it as sort of one-off implementations like maybe we did in the past when solutions weren't as easy to, weren't as secure, weren't as easy for our end users to understand. Now that they are, now that we've got solutions like these YubiKeys that can really fit into a security paradigm without a lot of training, without a lot of difficulty, without a lot of headaches, and with full control over the keys, we can start implementing multi-factor authentication everywhere, right? For our VPN, for our cloud infrastructure, our on-prem infrastructure, for our cloud applications, for our local applications, everything that you see here for our end users, for our privileged users, that's what Centrify really provides that framework so that we can implement common multi-factor authentication policy across everything. But we can't do it by challenging users too often. We want to make sure that we make it easy for users so that they don't rebel, which happened to me in the past, right, when I was IT years ago, where folks would say, hey, this is too much, this is too cumbersome, I can't do it. We have to make it easy for folks. So if we move to the next slide, please, what does this really look like? Well, it means that we have to have adaptive multi-factor authentication. It has to be secure, it has to meet IT-based policies, but it has to be flexible enough so that users are challenged at the right time with the right amount of information. So for example, we could use context-based policy that says if folks are accessing from a trusted device on the right time of day, or if they're the right kind of user, then we don't necessarily challenge them every time, but we certainly want, for someone to log into a Unix or Linux system, yeah, let's make sure that they've got their YubiKey present, for example, right? If they're coming from a network that we've not seen before, well, that's weird. Let's challenge them for multi-factor authentication, or maybe let's block them entirely. We need to make sure that this policy is such that for our privileged users, we're making sure the environment's nice and locked down. For someone who's just logging into, I don't know, Box from their local machine on the corporate network, maybe easy thing that we can just let them get single sign-on into without any other challenges, or maybe we want to include that extra step of authentication if they're logging into NetSuite or Concur, for example. Those applications don't need to be configured specifically to know anything about multi-factor authentication. Centrify can handle that on the way, right, sort of in front of those applications or servers or VPN, whatever it may be. And like we're talking about with the backups, we can configure multiple backups so that if the first factor that we're expecting isn't available, then we can move to an SMS or a push notification to a mobile device, for example, whatever it may be. We can leverage derived credentials. So if we're using a smart card like we're talking about, or we're using PIV-compliant solutions, like a YubiKey with its PIV functionality to actually talk to a Windows machine, well, maybe we want to use that, access the same information, those same resources that require that smart card-like authentication. We can derive that credential, put it on a mobile device, for example, and then allow mobile access as well to those same secure resources without a username and password at all, but with that derived credential, that secure authentication that actually gets in there instead. Next slide, please. With this flexibility, with the right kind of authentication, then we can provide multi-factor auth for application access, whether the application knows anything about MFA or not. So the Joe's Crab Shack rewards point app that's not very sophisticated can now be locked down and secured with multi-factor authentication. And something like Concur NetSuite, like we talked about before, can also be locked down with multi-factor auth on an app-by-app basis, available via adaptive MFA, that policy that we talked about. Whether it's an on-prem or a cloud app, without changing the app, we can actually implement multi-factor auth in front of it. So we can combine that with single sign-on to make it easy to get in and protect that app regardless. Next slide, please. In the very same way that we can protect applications, we can secure VPN. So since VPN typically all support the Radius protocol, Centrify can act as a Radius gateway that actually provides a way to say, hey, before we enable this VPN connection, let's make sure that we've presented a second factor of authentication. We do that very simply. Again, nearly every VPN that's in use today supports this protocol. It's very easy to figure out how to get that Radius support pointed over to Centrify so that we can actually have our cloud connector, we speak, initiate that multi-factor authentication. Very simple software install, points over the VPN, says, hey, I'm going to do some authentication for you before we let that guy in. Next slide, please. We're talking about applications, we're talking about VPN. We should also talk about the servers that applications run on, of course. We want to block those kinds of attacks here so we can implement multi-factor authentication for login and for privilege elevation. So again, making it the right place. If somebody logs onto a machine, maybe you want to make sure that they've authenticated with multi-factor auth, or maybe you want to do it when they're actually elevating privilege, right? On a Linux machine, if they're logging in and they actually want to go ahead and switch user to root, for example, or certainly to like an Oracle user, for example, or some DBA, maybe we want to challenge for multi-factor authentication at that point. Again, this is all based on policy that can say who can do what and where, what servers versus what groups of users, all tied back to a common directory infrastructure so that we can make sure that the MFA is done at the right time for the right people. And we'll go to our next slide lastly here to talk about the fact that it also works as well with smart card-based login. So we can completely eliminate passwords like David was talking about by providing derived credentials on the mobile device and native support like you have on Windows or on OS X devices for smart card login to Macs as well. So we want to make sure that every device is protected with smart card like, you know, PIV, essentially PIV and CAT compliant access to get into these things. And we want to do it without additional cumbersome hardware, and we want to do it with that touch-based ability as much as we can. Make sure a real human is there so that, again, we don't have the software that's been installed by a malicious actor that's actually being able to access that smart card credential. Almost defeats the purpose in that case. I think at this point, what we should do is move on to sort of that next slide, and I think we can move forward to questions. We've got David, we've got myself. We can hear questions from you folks. Thank you so much.
Please, on the, if you do have questions, we've had some that have come through, but on the GoToWebinar side panel, there's a questions slot that you can enter questions, and we'll address them as they come through. So I'll start with question number 1, and that is, how many YubiKeys can be registered with Centrify?
Sure, I think I'll take that one. No known limit has been found. I think is the easiest way to say that. You know, depending on your user infrastructure, your user count. Wow, sometimes I say the wrong word. How many employees you've got, how many folks you need. We can register those keys. We can keep them coming up, and one of the things that our customers really like about the solution is that they do it themselves. They can order the right amount of YubiKeys, and they can enroll full themselves. They don't have to work with the different external. I think David was talking about that themselves. So we haven't seen that upper limit yet in any way. We want to support as many users as you need, and we want to make sure that that scales. That's part of the beauty of our cloud-based solution, is we can scale as necessary.
Great, thank you. Next is, how does this integrate with my existing identity infrastructure?
Sure, I think I'll take some of that as well. Centrify was really built, we've been around about 13 years. When originally our solution started out, we wanted to extend Active Directory infrastructure to things that didn't speak Windows, didn't speak AD, so Unix and Linux systems primarily. That was many, many years ago, right? But what we've always kept along with us that whole way is leveraging existing infrastructure to provide identity-based policy wherever it needs to be. So now it's not just Unix and Linux, it's Unix, Linux, Windows, Mac, cloud-based applications, mobile devices, you name it. But what we want to do is leverage your existing AD, your existing LDAP. If you use a different directory, a Google Cloud directory, we want to tie back to that as well. And we do it with a proxy-based architecture. So we're not copying multiple copies of directory information in different places. We're just allowing you to point back to your single source of truth and then make decisions based on that. So if you use AD, that's great. Continue to use Active Directory and let that be the single source of truth. If you've got LDAP or a combination, you can do that. You can use Centrify's Cloud Directory as well. If you're a smaller company or just starting out, or you want to consolidate with a cloud directory, we've got that directory as a service functionality. We want to make it flexible. We call it identity where you want it, and it really ties back to your own infrastructure, however you need it to be.
Great, thank you. Next, will the smaller nano form factor of the YubiKey fall out of my USB if I'm carrying my laptop around?
I'll take this one. No, the YubiKey Nano is designed to fit securely and snugly inside the USB port. In fact, we recommend using it if you're going to be removing it. Use a lanyard with the Nano because it does sit so snugly in it. It can be a little bit difficult to take out. With that, though, it was designed to sit almost completely inside a USB port, and it succeeds admirably at that task. We've had users try to shake it out themselves. It won't pop out. Let's just put it that way.
Okay, great, thank you. Another YubiKey question. You're showing the YubiKey underwater. Is it waterproof?
Yes, due to the fact that the YubiKey is a single monoblock design with no internal cavities or open spaces, there's no access for water to get to any of the internal components inside. The exposed contacts, the gold parts, are military-grade hardened gold, which won't corrode or tarnish in salt water. In fact, we've had users who lost their YubiKeys in a parking lot in the middle of Denver in winter. Went through the entire winter with the salt, the ice, the snow, the slush, all that good stuff, only to find it in the spring when all the snow melted, to wash it off, thankfully, plug it into their computer and have it continue to work just fine.
Great, thank you. Another YubiKey question. Is touching the YubiKey similar to a biometric?
The YubiKey is a capacitance sensor, not a biometric. That's because in today's technology, biometric are just not at a point where they can be easy to use, that is, and you just need to touch them, but still at the same time be reliable enough that it will always work. There are situations where biometrics just will not register if you don't have enough whorls on your fingers, if you've had damage to the fingertips. It's just not at a point where we can fit a biometric reader on a YubiKey that would be sensitive enough to capture everyone's fingers 100%, be that reliable. And unfortunately, biometrics that are available for commercial use aren't secure enough. I'm sure everybody's heard about the iPhone, including their biometrics in their latest releases. However, at the same time, less than a day out of that, people were recommending ways to get around that biometrics using things as simple as Play-Doh to capture the fingerprints left previously, the oils there, and trigger the phone into thinking that you're a legitimate user that way. So until the state-of-the-art change to the point where we have a biometric sensor that meets the security of the YubiKey, the reliability of the YubiKey, and the low affordable cost of the YubiKey, will remain with the capacitance sensor.
Thank you. Next question is for Centrify, and that is how is Centrify Identity licensed?
Sure. Identity Services is licensed per user per month, so it's a subscription. That's part and parcel of being a cloud-based service. So we want to make it easy for folks to get in and scale as they need to, have the right amount of employees there. It's not done by applications, so if you've got 5 apps or 50 apps, if you have tons of devices or a few devices, we want to make it easy and not difficult. You can actually see pricing at Centrify.com. If you look in sort of compare editions areas, you can see our different various editions and the pricing that's there. We want to be pretty transparent with that and make it easy to figure out. We also, I should mention, have a free trial as well that you can actually fire up your own cloud instance and test it out before any commitments are made.
Great, thank you. And one last question that just came through for Yubico would be, with the YubiKey Nano being stuck in the port, wouldn't that somewhat defeat the purpose? What if you happen to lose your laptop?
We recommend the YubiKey Nano to be used in situations where the machine that you're using with is in a location, a secured location, essentially making it a privileged access terminal. If you're going to be moving in a public environment, say laptops and whatnot, we recommend using the full keychain size, just because it's easier to keep track of. You can keep it on literally on your keychain, and it does not lead to the situation where if your laptop's stolen, your YubiKey would be most likely plugged into it. Most of the time, people plug the YubiKey in, perform the authentication action by touching the button, and then once they're done logging into whatever service they need to, remove it, put it back in their pockets with their keys and whatnot. The Nano is designed for situations where the machines are always going to be in a secure location. Facebook, for example, really likes the Nano because they only want their users accessing privileged databases on the Facebook campus itself. Therefore, the Nano is plugged into the machines on the secured campus, which are never taken home.
Great, thank you, David. So we're done. That's all the questions that have come through. So again, we would like to thank everyone for attending, and also be sure to be on the lookout for a special offer that's going to be coming in the follow-up email from Centrify and Yubico. Thank you again, and have a great day.